I just think it's very interesting for Netflix to be like, here's this fake Netflix that's bad and is using AI, but also we won't give in to WGA's demands because we're Netflix and we hate you.
So, Unlivable Unlivable Podcast.
We're keeping that in.
Unlivable Poultures. What the fuck?
I'm gonna need a second, I think.
For those who cannot see because you're listening, Cody and Julia are currently crying because I am so funny.
That's probably the funniest thing I've heard in a long time. Like,
Action.
I have to get in character. Welcome to Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from social theory, anthropology, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. My name is Cody Scahan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joined by
Julia Coverdale, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Clayton Gerard. I use he, him pronouns.
Today's episode, we're talking about the latest season 5, right? Is it season 5?
I think it's season 6.
God damn it. Okay.
Like the Antichrist, 666.
Okay, so we're talking about the the latest season of Black Mirror. Yeah. I don't know. Anything else to add?
We did talk about discussing dystopia and utopia and utopian thinking and stuff at some point. That won't be a spoiler section. Otherwise, I make no promises. I'll probably be spoiling the shit out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with these episodes, like at least the discussion I want to have with them, especially as I talked about too with as like modern pieces, you kind of have to spoil them. Because a lot of it's about like
all the like interesting
the setup and the ending.
Yeah.
So time and temporality. I figured this would go at the beginning of the episode so people could listen to some of it before, we get into spoiler territory. I find it interesting, and you'll hear this later in the episode.
Messing with time.
Yeah. At some point, one of the directors for the episodes, Jonas Awful specifically, mentioned that Charlie Brooker was prophetic in writing the episode years ago, when now we have the issues with AI and writers striking in Hollywood and everything else. And just as we talk throughout the episode, like Black Mirror, and the title itself blurs fiction with reality, and the fact that you turn your TV off and it's a black mirror, and you watch the show on a black mirror. And then also it's been a staple of Black Mirror that a lot of the things foretold in Black Mirror as kind of a dystopian future are starting to come to fruition. One specific example is Apple's come out with the Vision Pro, which is basically like these goggles that you put on and you can see a simulation almost of apps and everything that you can see on your phone, and it's right in front of your eyes. And then you can also do special things to make it disappear and you can see what's in front of you, etc. And the promo for the whole campaign launched in like May or something. And then all of a sudden, people are making like mock promotions for Black Mirror using it because it's such a closely associated thing with Black Mirror that people could, in their eyes, see what's on their phone or look something up on the internet and so on and so forth. And I know Black Mirror was trending when the Vision Pro was announced and everything else because people were like, have we not learned anything from Black Mirror? And it just makes me think, I guess, to start this discussion with temporality and notions of time and such, that this idea that Black Mirror is some dystopian narrative, and as the years go on, more and more of it comes true, and then all of a sudden it's like Black Mirror isn't the future, we're living in Black Mirror now.
Talking about time and temporality and Black Mirror predicting things is interesting too. It opens up the question of like a two-way valve of like, in what case of it is like, Black Mirror actually taking inspiration from maybe earlier works, earlier sort of things that actually happen, and then bringing it to a more futuristic setting. And then, of course, that thing is going to happen because it's in some ways a development of something in the past? Or is it also, it could be like, not to give too much credit to anyone, but just to say Black Mirror itself as this cultural phenomenon that has, I don't know, at least probably tens of millions of people have watched, influencing the people watching it.
And I think that's a really interesting entry point into a discussion of time and dystopia and utopic thinking, and how we get caught up in thinking about time linearly or thinking about time in different ways and models, and also how we have certain histories of the future and how that informs the present. There's quite a bit of material troubling the linear notion of time and thinking of potentially like a circular notion of time, like religious traditions that think of time in more circular ways. And then you get some more concepts of like reincarnation and those kinds of things that trouble time. But like even thinking about circular time in a sense is linear. Like a line makes a circle. That makes sense, right? A line makes a circle. If you're thinking of like a black circle on a white paper,
Yeah.
a black circle is a line. But like I've heard one person recently named Bioakumalafe, I think is how you pronounce his name, what he calls slushy time, where it's more fluid and more porous and you can't separate these things. And I think, you know, we're starting to get to a place in our culture, like Western Eurocentric culture, where we're considering time in more complex and nuanced ways. Not to say that we didn't formerly, but like, you know, thinking of trauma, we got The Body Keeps the Score, and it's basically talking about how, you know, past events can still have present biological impacts and realities. And that's part of a whole transition to rethinking about time in different ways of how like our bodies experience it, our minds experience it, how the body mind in a singular form experience it, and so on and so forth. And I think these ideas with Black Mirror kind of get at slushy time because it's like with season 6 specifically, like having an avatar that's basically a robot to look like a human in the 1960s. If we're thinking of time linearly, like that doesn't fit. But if you think of it circularly, it kind of could, because thinking of like future and past, like 1960s and then future technology of an avatar could eventually meet on a line. But thinking of it in the context of us relating to it in the present moment now, because of the social isolation aspect of COVID, it blends the past, the present, and the future in an interesting way. And it also creates what Harding and someone in the book Histories of the Future creates, like a history of the future. Like it's a way of thinking about the future that has its own history. And even that future doesn't come to fruition, it still has an entire cultural context through which that future was plausible to imagine. I kind of want to go off of that as well, thinking about José Esteban Muñoz's Cruising Utopia. Muñoz relates queerness to futurity and hope and imagination. And thinking of like Lee Edelman's No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, he's talking about the capital C child that is like an ever-present horizon. Like it's the child that is the reason that queer people and trans people can't have rights, and so on and so forth. It's all about maintaining the innocence and the sanctity and the safety of the child that like is never actually coming. It's just a constant horizon in front of us that we have to position our culture and society towards. And so like, you know, the idea of the child, that in itself has a history of the future, kind of.
But yeah, I think the whole like histories of the future notion is to kind of a bit what I was trying to hit on earlier. Well, I will hit on later in the episode, yeah, with talking about how each episode of the Black Mirror, of the first 3 episodes of the new Black Mirror season, it's like I think in what, especially the 3rd episode, does reflect by having this sort of the Jetsons. I think it's the Jetsons, but like the sort of like when you watch it today as a kid, because it's like old timey sort of like cartoon, but it's also set in the future when they have flying cars and all of this thing. So it's like this common sort of history of the future reflecting on the norms of the past, but also how they manipulate or like manifest in the present through a lens of science fiction, future alternative possibilities. I like the slushiness aspect to it because it is, I mean, it's kind of like that goes into, I think, what a lot of people think of as postmodernism, of the slushiness of the, meaning doesn't matter and there's nothing to like think about in terms of time. But it's like, then this sort of Black Mirror move, I mean, and that's not exactly what postmodernism even is. It's I think a certain reading of it, but.
And I don't even want to constrain Akumulafe's idea of like slushy time to, a Western category of postmodernism, because
no.
Slushy time, as he's talking about it, is a different experience based on non-Western Eurocentric culture's conception of time and like the fluidity of it. And also talking about this, like it's important to recognize time and notions of time aren't apolitical or absent of power. These understandings are constituted based on power hierarchies that exist and racial hierarchies and colonialism and everything else. With globalization that's occurred over the past few decades, there is a colonizing of time, and the ways that we're experiencing it and understanding and processing time in itself is a political act. And it does have consequence in how we're living in the present, how we're recounting the past, and how we're dreaming of the future. Robyn Wiegman, I believe is how you pronounce her last name, wrote a piece called Feminism's Apocalyptic Futures, and she talks about the issues. Let me get this right. The future of feminism is problematic in some ways and fraught with issues because the present hasn't dealt with the fact that the past promises of feminism haven't come to fruition. So it's the time piece that's really important because, thinking back 50 years, there were goals, there were dreams, there were utopias being imagined. And the fact that hasn't come to fruition creates a problem for us in the present as we're trying to dream up futures and utopias and everything else. Our understanding of time isn't apolitical. There is power involved in these things. It's very nuanced and complex, so I don't feel like I'm doing the whole field of future studies justice in talking about this, but I do want to plant the seeds of the ideas, I guess, and talk about how things like Black Mirror are caught up in these imaginings of the future and creating futures that do have histories that are very political and very important, even if those futures don't come to fruition. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is like the colonization of time, which I just briefly alluded to. And Sardar has a great edited volume, I guess is what you call it, Rescuing All Our Futures. And they also have an article about decolonizing future studies. And it's really interesting to dive into this work because future studies is a little bit esoteric, a little bit abstract, and at times hard to grasp, but they talk about technology is seen as the sole resource of the West. And so there's all these other cultures out in the world that don't think of the future in terms of, the advancement of technology. They think of it in different terms, but take Black Mirror, for example. People are constantly talking about it as a show where technology goes bad and horrible things happen. And it's in our popular consciousness of what the future is, like this dystopian thinking of the Hunger Games, Black Mirror, Handmaid's Tale, those types of things. Handmaid's Tale is a different thing because
we're not touching that today.
A little prescient like Black Mirror in some ways. Yeah, and the ways in which we're thinking about the future is caught up and entangled in the ways that we construct the present and the power and politics and everything else that's at play. So one part of Sardar's piece, Rescuing All Our Futures, says, through its obsession with forecasting and prediction, its technology fetish, and its almost total neglect of non-Western cultures and visions, future studies promotes the colonization of the future. And they say, indeed, future studies has become synonymous with Western domination. I just want to call that to attention as we're talking about Black Mirror and kind of the meanings that it brings up and the critiques and the new ways of thinking about things and the possibilities of the future, is that this is a very specific future that it's talking about. It's a Western technology dominated, racialized society.
Yeah.
And like, it's not apart from what we're living in. There is a slushiness to the time that's there. There is a blurring of the boundaries between, the real and the fiction, especially in ways that we're going to talk about the specific episodes that Netflix has used and that other people are interacting with these episodes. It brings to question, how different some Black Mirror aspects are from reality. But as I said, I just want to bring attention to the fact that it is a very specific future that it's bringing up, and futurity is not a neutral understanding or concept or vision.
Yeah, that's a really important critique. Yeah. And then it brings into question how we construct the past also.
And how do we construct the past?
Mostly by technology changes. So shockingly, but yeah, at least in archaeology, that a lot of the ways that we construct the past and different time periods is through change. And because it's material culture, a lot of the ways that we can track change is through technological changes. We're kind of getting into archaeological theory.
One thing I want to bring up to kind of critique myself in some ways, possibly, or I guess maybe
Metamodernism.
Nuance, but like to go off, continuing on some of what Sardar writes about, they say futurists who use non-Western philosophies and modes of knowing as the basis for constructing alternative visions of the future and work for that vision operate strictly in the European tradition of humanism, a tradition that is totally enveloped in the secularist worldview. The end product of their thought is often a grotesque parody of non-Western thought, philosophy, and tradition. As such, even the new spirituality and, quote, values conform to the dictates of secularism, and thus, Western domination and colonization and such. So I say that to say, in hopefully being reflexive, it's important to acknowledge that just drawing on these other cultures' modes and understandings of time and futurity and so on isn't enough to, we can't just appropriate that and say oh, there's different ways of thinking about it, but acknowledge that and give credence to those worldviews and understandings and be humble in learning from that, and not just say, oh, this exists, so we need to think about this differently and appropriate those ideas. It's about deconstructing the entirety of our understandings and not just, trying to sound interesting.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's not just to say, look at this other culture with this interesting, complex idea of futurity and different way of thinking about time. But yeah, that's not enough necessarily.
So let's go ahead and transition to the episode discussion. Warning, there's going to be lots of spoilers. So do not listen to this if you have not watched the first 3 episodes of the newest season of Black Mirror.
I'll just start with this. This is my first hot take for these episodes. I thought they were so predictable. I mean, from the beginning, I'm like, I know where this is going. I'm sorry. I didn't think they were very unpredictable or anything like that. So just saying, that's my take.
Yeah, I don't think that they were very unpredictable. To be fair, I've not watched other seasons of Black Mirror, so that's also the perspective that I'm coming from. But sometimes I think not being predictable is better because that the writers had a good setup and payoff. But
you're saying it's better if it's not predictable, or if it is?
I think it depends. I think sometimes it's better if it is predictable because that the writers
I gotcha.
did their job when it comes to setup and then payoff.
Yeah, I mean, it is supposed to be basically social commentary. So it's okay, being predictable, you can see this actually happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like the sort of modern take on it, which I should describe before I go too much further and say, a bunch of shit. Modern is basically sort of recreating or trying to be surrealistic on the modern reflection. So there's the traditional sort of separations of postmodernism, which would be like, in terms of film, Mission Impossible or Top Gun, that one. Yeah. So that's like the modern film because it's like classic about entertainment, blockbuster, all this stuff. And then postmodern is a bit like surreal, meaning flows over the place, and it's like creative, and it's like everywhere, everything all at once, whatever that one was. That one's supposed to be kind of like postmodern. And then mid-modern is like more reflective. For example, in the first episode of the new season of Black Mirror, they talk about Streamberry, which is like a sort of modern take on Netflix, because it's basically the same thing. So it's reflecting on Netflix as a medium in a way, and how like data, digital consent, and all of that is interpreted and like manifest through Netflix these days, and the things that can go bad with that. So anyway, that's kind of in a nutshell modern. But also, I wasn't very much entertained in that regard. It just made me feel like something that's like, oh, you should be thinking about this. You should be scared. You should be reflecting on reality and all of that. And I did a bit, but I didn't think it was that deep and just not that interesting for me, at least. But let's see what Clayton has to say, though.
But does it need to be that deep?
I knew it.
I enjoyed the first episode, Jonah is Awful. I just found it generally enjoyable to watch. I wasn't sitting there watching it trying to predict the plot and everything else. Like, I used to watch movies and TV shows like that, and now I'm just kind of more up for, let's just see where it goes and ride along in the adventure instead of trying to analyze it the entire time. So just taking that step back, I found it enjoyable. More generally, it's really interesting because some of the critic reviews and like audience reviews that I've read have been pretty disappointed with the 6th season of Black Mirror. The Jonah's Awful episode hasn't had extremely great reviews in a lot of areas, because I think a lot of people associate Black Mirror with some like really hard-hitting, provocative, techno-driven stories and stuff. But this one, I mean, even looking at the director, it was made to be a comedy. Like all the reading that I've done about the episode, it was made to be a comedy. The director directed The Great from Hulu, Shrill, a lot of other like comedy TV shows. And that's also kind of a thing that the writer, Charlie Brooker, he's talked about. You know, like a lot of people just say that Black Mirror is some show about how bad technology is. And that's not really the case. It's more about humanity and how humans behave in different situations. It's kind of like saying, oh, I was watching The Walking Dead and I knew that someone was going to get bit by a zombie. Well, yeah, I don't know. I used to be really obsessed with The Walking Dead. So it's like, it's not about zombies. It's about the humans and humanity. They're the Walking Dead kind of thing.
Is that why the show's called The Black Mirror? Because it's like, we're looking at ourselves. It's a reflection.
Exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
Because a TV turned off is a Black Mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of really interesting ways to look at it that aren't just about, you know, Black Mirror having an episode that has a mind-blowing plot twist that you don't expect and it makes you rethink everything. I think a lot of it in this season was more like thought experiment, and let's see where this story goes, and let's see how people behave in these scenarios and what this brings up. I want to get into time and temporality at some point later.
Later in time. We'll get to it.
I mean, one example is kind of like the audience reaction to Jonah is Awful. I don't know if you saw, but Netflix created this like thing where people could put their pictures and names and such, and they had to sign a terms and agreement package to like let Netflix have their likeness and personal information, and Netflix would generate a cover of like Julia is awful, Cody is awful with your pictures and everything else. And then Netflix started using that for advertisements in different countries, like putting that on billboards and stuff. And it was like, holy shit, now it's another level where this Jonah is Awful experience in the episode is now happening to real people in the real world because they signed on to the terms and agreements that Netflix offered. And it's kind of this breaking of the fourth wall and every wall, kind of. I don't know. But it was just really interesting to see how Netflix and Black Mirror has kind of blurred the boundaries of fiction and reality in some ways like that, especially thinking about how people have talked about past episodes and how certain things have come to fruition or come true or been foretold in those episodes. So it's kind of weird to see the interplay between, like what's happening in the show and the fact that it's also happening in real life, and people aren't, learning the quote lessons from the show.
I also think too the AI aspect of that episode is really interesting, because like the whole concept is that like the actors for like the name is awful basically like license their likeness to be used for these shows. And I think that that's really interesting to consider, given how like prevalent discussions around AI are currently in like literally every aspect of like scientific writing, creative stuff. I mean, it's a core part
podcast episodes.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a core part of some of the WGA's like striking.
And for context, on May 2nd, 2023, the Writers Guild of America, which represents screenwriters, went on strike. A couple months earlier, on March 14th, the WGA released a report, Writers Are Not Keeping Up, which talked about how companies have leveraged the advent of streaming services to, quote, underpay writers, creating more precarious, lower-paid models for writers' work. There's less compensation and more insecurity with this onslaught of streaming services and the TV gig economy. And in just the last 5 years, screenwriting pay has decreased by 14%. Also, on July 12th, after a 12-day extended discussion, the Screen Actors Guild went on strike. 2 days after recording our conversation, the AMPTP said of negotiations with SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, that they included a, quote, groundbreaking AI proposal that protects actors' digital likenesses for SAG-AFTRA members. Duncan Crabtree Ireland, COO and General Counsel of Screen Actors Guild and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, claimed that AMPTP had proposed, quote, background performers should be able to be scanned, get 1 day's pay, and their companies should own that scan, their image, their likeness, and should be able to use it for the rest of eternity on any project they want with no consent and compensation. An AMPTP spokesperson denied this, but that is currently where the situation is at.
I just think it's very interesting for Netflix to be like, here's this fake Netflix that's bad and is using AI, but also we won't give in to WGA's demands because we're Netflix and we hate you.
It is like a tongue-in-cheek kind of like, oh, this is Netflix. Yes, we have terms and conditions. Yes, you foolishly probably consented to them without reading all the fine print and all of this. I don't know. That's why I read it as meta-modern and think it is kind of more interesting, and along with what Clayton was talking about. Because part of modernism is connecting moments of like the romanticism of modernism, which you see in like Top Gun, stuff like this, with the sort of more intellectual engagement or like sort of cultural sensibilities of postmodernism. But it's like, it's not like necessarily a mix or somewhere in the middle between the two, but as like they talk about, sometimes it like oscillates between the two. So it's kind of like postmodernism maybe like realizes it, critiques it, doesn't take it seriously, but then it kind of goes back to, I think, the more modernism angle that says this is realistic, this is what actually happens. It is interesting to take that like sort of more the psychological angle of how humans would act in these situations.
Yeah, and I find it interesting because Charlie Brooker, I was reading, actually tried writing an episode of Black Mirror with AI, just shooting shit and see what comes out. And he was like, I let it write an episode of Black Mirror, and then I read it, and it was total shit. He was like, it's basically just an amalgamation of all the Black Mirror episodes that have been created to this point. And he was like, but it was actually really useful to see a lot of the patterns that I had fallen into in previous episodes and iterations and like seasons of Black Mirror, which is why a lot of the episodes in this season are a lot different. You'll see it specifically in episode 4. He starts to go back in time. So one episode is in like the 19th, or episode 3 is in like the 60s. And it's like, well, holy shit, Black Mirror episodes aren't in the past usually. So it kind of recasts these things and brings up new questions and new inquiries and thought processes and thinking about like, you know, is this a different dimension? Is just those kinds of things.
Sounds like Charlie Brooker might be an AI though. He's learning iteratively, it sounds like, but you know, the machine learning kind of aspect of it almost.
Also really interesting. I was reading an article, I'm not sure if I shared it, but the director of the first episode, Jonah's Awful, was talking about the writer's strike and how prescient the episode plot is because you have AI that's creating these entire narratives and generating it on its own, divorced from any human influence and such. And at that point, she was saying that Charlie Brooker is very prophetic in a lot of his work because, you know, this was written and created years ago. And all of a sudden we're having these writer strikes and also this huge, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a controversy. It's just like concern.
Kerfuffle.
About AI and the ethics and the legal aspects and everything else. And like recently it came out that Sarah Silverman is suing ChatGPT or whomever about, you know, the fact that her material was loaded into the AI and everything else. And a lot of these questions that, you know, weren't happening at the time the episode is written, but that the episode deals with are now occurring. And so it's just a disorienting kind of spot to be, which is also really, what's the word I'm looking for? Stimulating. I was like, that's a non-erotic word.
The most non-erotic word.
Jesus Christ. I also just think too, I mean, we've already talked about websites using our data and buying it and all of those things. But I think a lot of people know that that is happening, but they just don't care because they don't see the consequences that could potentially come from that. And obviously this is a fictionalized version of that, but I do think it's interesting to like kind of show like Netflix basically has access to all this information about your life to the point where we could simulate your life and then literally ruin it. So many people think that like buying and selling data from social media sites and websites and all of those things like doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think Black Mirror definitely has its value in that case. Yeah, trying to take these things, I think, super seriously rather than just hitting on like any shock value or anything like that. Black Mirror, people have said this before, I think, about all of the seasons, but I think especially true about this season. Like this is something I can actually see really, really happening and things going that way. Actually, the third episode so this is where they don't really give a whole lot of context about what they're doing, but there's 2 astronauts basically on a space station, and they're the only 2 manning the space station. It's pretty small. They're doing some sort of research, I presume, but then they have like these mechanical copies of themselves on Earth that they can control, like when they essentially go to sleep, I guess. They just sit in this bed and they turn a key and then they enter their mechanical bodies and control it, experience everything through that mechanical body that looks like them. It's a copy of them on Earth. And that's like something I could definitely see. If we had the technology to do it, I'm like, of course they would have done that like a long time ago. So it's interesting to see like, in this case, a critique of, I guess, a little bit of like technology and science and the way that we talk about and think about like, the world is limitless and everything like that. Like it's a critique of transhumanism a bit in a way, I see, of like saying that just this melding of technology with humans would solve everything. But it's like not a too dystopian. The world appears pretty nice, like nice 1960s setting, very homey. This is kind of the modern romantic aspect of it. But then there's just this extra element of the technology that like spoiled a bit.
So episode 3 compared to episode 1 and 2 to me was like so farther out there. So it took my brain like a little bit to like get it, if that makes sense. But I do think like what Cody was talking about, that there's interesting like reflections on heteronormativity and the nuclear family, because I think it's very interesting to think about like the creation of these mechanical bodies just to really support and continue the nuclear family dynamic. Because it's not like the men are already doing their jobs, they're up in space, they're doing the research up there. They exist to like both further like that view, but also like obviously human connection is important, but you don't really get a government to build you two mechanical bodies or versions of yourselves just because you're like, but I need human connection.
Yeah, in a way, like I liked that episode the most, actually, of the three. Perhaps maybe because it was a bit more out there. But I think 3 was like the strongest, as Julie was saying, like the critique of the heteronormative family and the fact that, like, and also I would say very strongly of just monogamy. There's this other astronaut that like lost his family, and yes, it's very traumatic, and they're saying like, I have nothing left to live for because I don't have my family anymore, which on one hand is like, yeah. On the other hand, it's like, I feel like it's for a second kind of opening up the possibility for other family formations to exist or other sort of possibilities to exist from that. But there's, both sort of like personal feelings of the wife being like, no, I don't want this other astronaut also to be part of our relationship or to be romantic with me or anything like this, while also, I don't know, could happen. That's just what I was thinking.
I can't remember what word you used, but almost like the alternative relationships and stuff that it brings up with the fact that, this guy is basically sharing his body with another person, and
with
wife,
another man.
Yeah, and the wife doesn't really, it's very complicated that you're seeing a different person or you're interacting with a different person that looks and sounds and smells and feels and tastes just like your husband, but it's a different person.
You really had to go to the tastes.
Well, I mean, spoiler, they kiss, don't they?
Yeah.
But also, it's like, to me, the real relationship that matters in this is between the two guys, and the ending, spoiler alert, where the widower basically goes into the other guy's body, uses his avatar, and kills the other guy's family so that they're both traveling in the spaceship alone and they only have each other. Like, that's a very profound tragedy. And if one of them dies, the other dies. So if one guy kills the other, then, they're both going to die because they're on that space mission and they've still got like 4 years left of the mission anyway. So Charlie Brooker wrote this episode during the pandemic and during the whole quarantine and lockdown. So that was kind of the impetus of like, what does this social isolation look like in different scenarios? But yeah, and it was also kind of, to me, just like a whole thing about loneliness, because I mean, going through loss is an awful experience in itself. So like the guy losing his family, for one, is horrific, and then also losing his avatar, which is basically his tether to Earth, is another thing. So basically what was meant to be like a 6-year expedition of his physical body, but he could still be on Earth the whole time, then turned into 6 year or 4 years, whatever, being stuck in this tin can in space. And you see the whole grappling that he does, trying to figure out how he's supposed to live. And if he kills himself, he's going to kill the other dude too. And the other dude has a family and a life and everything else. And then ultimately we see their relationship to, have a lot more conflict and everything else. And then it's just a matter of, to me, it was just kind of loneliness and like, can't live in this spaceship for another 4 years alone while you're enjoying time with your family and you don't deserve them anyway, kind of thing. And then he basically wants that empathy and that understanding and the other guy to relate to him. And then it's just, a resignation at the end of like, well, now what? I don't know. Not that this stuff even has to mean anything. Like, I don't know. Is that postmodern in itself to just be like, there is no meaning to these stories?
Words don't matter.
You telling me that was written during the pandemic makes so much more sense now.
Yeah.
And also, when you said a tin can in space, my mind immediately went to the submarine So
the Ocean Gate one, or whatever it's called.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking Space Oddity, but okay.
Yeah, me too. That too. Yeah.
Don't get me started on the Titan thing.
Yeah.
Not this episode.
What you're saying with the loneliness and the sort of tragedy, and like it is a bit like just the classical storytelling aspects of that coming through too, of like the bringing in a bit of the modernism, and especially in this episode, I feel like it is a very reflective thing of like, yes, it's this really interesting situation, but also like the domestic disputes were and all of that was like at an all-time high during COVID, because people were just like trapped together away from a lot of other mediation, say, or other like outlets. They're around each other all the time. And so, yeah, it is very interesting how that's what the purpose of sci-fi, I think, is. And Black Mirror does it pretty good of like taking this like exceptional sort of futuristic scenario and then actually using it to reflect about on our own lives and situations and everything like that. So that part of it's like, it hits at the core sort of elements, I think, of like, you know, a sort of like classic tragedy, but also reflection on technology, but also just hitting at home to today. It's very interesting. So I like that episode pretty good. The other two, yeah.
I have lots of thoughts about Loch Henry personally.
Spill them.
So I'm like very much somebody that is like into like horror movies, and
I thought you were going to say true crime, and I was going to be like,
me too.
I didn't expect it, but I can also see it. But like, is there any archaeological true crime?
Ooh, that's a good question, actually.
I mean, yeah, because there's people who still are like, who murdered Utsi the Iceman? And it's like, you're never gonna fucking know. Like, that's not the reason that like Utsi is archaeologically important, but that's like,
I think his name was Stan. I don't know anything about him, but that Stan character from 50 million BC.
50 million.
He was a suspicious one. I don't know. 50 million, that's probably a little bit long.
I think that the Loch Henry episode is like interesting because it feels less, this is what could happen, and more like this is what is currently happening. I feel like everything that happens in Loch Henry is pretty like based in horror movies, and also like a little bit of the reality of like true crime and documentarianism. I don't know if that's the right word, but you know, like making documentaries.
I think that's a word.
Okay.
I think that is a word.
Thank you. I mean, the episode is pretty slow to begin with, but I think that it's interesting when they start to shift to telling the story of Ian Adair, to see the different reactions of all of the different like community members, as well as like the different motivations for like Pia and also for the Irish guy. What's his actual name? Davis. Yeah, there are different like motivations for Davis and Pia, because Pia is like literally just like, this is a good story that we should tell and it could get us fame. And Davis is like, this is a story that if we tell it, it could revitalize my hometown and like the people that I care about, their businesses and everything. The twist at the end is like, I saw it coming, because it's just very horror movie to be like, oh yes, the like Black woman and the elderly mother are going home alone together, and
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the old woman gets creepy.
Yeah. I think this episode should just be us patting ourselves on the back for predicting the very predictable things. So,
but I think it is an interesting like analysis or look into like the making of true crime and the fascination with true crime in our culture, and also like the real harm that fascination with true crime can have on individuals, because Davis's life is basically entirely wrecked by making this documentary, because he learns out that his mother and father both the main driving force of all of these murders, and that they were just like horrible, terrible people. His girlfriend,
sadistic sociopaths.
it was they were very stimulating. To use an erotic word.
Stimulated.
And also like, and his girlfriend dies in the culmination of her discovering that his parents were the reason that these murders happened. Also, this episode is very like ACAB as well, which I did appreciate.
And that stands for all cops are bottoms, if you're wondering. Nothing against bottoms. Sorry, that's probably a bad way to say it. All cops are bastards is the actual thing. We're not going to get into the position shaming and the whole like gender phobia around all that stuff.
I also think like one of the more interesting parts also of Loch Henry is how Davis basically becomes famous, wins, I think whatever their version of an Oscar was in that episode, or maybe it was an Oscar for the documentary. And he has definitely not had any time to process any of the deeply, deeply traumatic experiences that he went through to literally create this documentary that profits off of the pain of the town, his pain, the death of his girlfriend. It's just very, I think, realistic look into the pain and the trauma that true crime and the true crime community and those types of investigations can bring upon individuals and like their families.
But that was like sort of alienated from maybe because of the sort of obsession, or I don't know, it seems to be a little bit more reflective like in this episode, because it's like, yeah, I mean, true crimes like fucked up, can be fucked up and ruin a family, community, but like also being in a very touristy spot, like I kind of get that, like the sort of conflicted feelings and experiences of that, because it's like people realize here tourism brings in a lot of money, it's completely changed the lives of a lot of people for the good and had a very different thing, but there is a bit of a dark underbelly to it, and there's a lot of sacrifices based on this tourism, and not everybody's happy with it. So it's like more like interesting nuanced perspective of, say, tourism and true crime.
One of the really interesting things about this episode and kind of the response to it, and it's part of my hesitation to some of our conversations about like, oh, this is what the meaning of this episode was, or like this is the lesson we were supposed to learn, is the town where they actually filmed Loch Henry is now overwhelmed with tourists and tourism, which was kind of ironic considering like in the actual episode, you know, they're creating this true crime documentary, and part of the reason why is to revitalize some of the town and make it not have this haunted specter feel to it of previous murders. Now people are going to the town because of a fictional story that was written about it that also like talked about how bad it can be for places to be exploited like that in some ways, or at least the ambivalence of, you know, that kind of thing. And I mean, like, it's not that, like, I'm not trying to make this sound like a big scandalous thing. It's not different than people going to Ireland and other places because of where they filmed Game of Thrones, or New Zealand to see where they filmed The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings and stuff. It's interesting because it's kind of the same thing that happened with the Joan is Awful piece, where, you know, people actually gave their personal information to get those promo materials with their name and their face on it. And then all of a sudden Netflix brilliantly uses those in actual advertisements for Black Mirror. And then, you know, we have a Black Mirror episode that's kind of talking about, part of it is like the negative aspect of shining, you know, a bright light on places to draw tourism and revitalize communities. And then, you know, that very thing happens out in the real world, thus again blurring the boundary, which, you know, Black Mirror kind of has a knack for blurring the boundary between the fiction and the real world. And even the title, Black Mirror, being the actual TV, kind of weird. But
weird, spooky, fun.
Like going a little bit back to the Joan is Awful piece too, where you were talking about metamodernism and Streamberry and how that in some ways could be like a critique of Netflix that Netflix is doing on itself. But it's like, you know, I think in some ways we get trapped in the good or bad argument kind of thing. And like, oh, Netflix is saying that it itself is bad because it's showing how bad Streamberry is, and Streamberry is Netflix in this other universe. And it's like, I don't even think that matters that much. All Netflix cares about is the profits. So like, you know, even this conversation is going into the void to go into the whole attention economy and just like talk about Netflix and Black Mirror and everything else. And we're just feeding into this cycle.
Damn. Did we fall for it? Like, just going with what you were saying earlier, Clayton, like, I agree, because it does feel a bit like the sort of wink, wink. Look, we hey, we're self-aware. We know that we're supposed to be the evil bad guys, and what we're doing is like we play into this exploitative sort of like data economy and all of this. And they're acknowledging it and trying to be like, haha, funny. But like, yeah, as you say, I don't think it matters.
And I mean, like, another part of the thing, and what's his name? Caspian Kang, I think his name, and the Loneliest Americans talks about kind of how corporations just appropriate a lot of the social justice orientation of our demographic, like 18 to 30-year-olds. And so they purposefully do this, even though they don't care, just to kind of get our attention, even if it is in a negative way, kind of like we're talking about. Like, this is a tactic and a strategy to just give into the critique enough to almost lend it credibility so that we lean into it and give it the credibility that they're wanting. But in doing so, we're actually just, giving them more cultural purchase, which is what we're doing in this episode. So it's working.
Wow. Okay.
And we fell for it. We're dumb sheeple like everyone else. I knew it.
So, like, go woke, go broke, I guess. Not really.
The woke mob, whatever you want to say, whatever we're a part of. Like, it is still another demographic to be exploited. And I feel like, Clayton, you should be a marketer or some sort of like executive for Netflix or something. You're really good at analyzing good strategies.
No, I mean, it's just like, even if they're doing it bad, it's all purposeful. So like in Kang's book, he mentions corporations seeking relevance in the 18 to 35 demographic hire ad agencies who scrape Twitter, print up bar graphs and word clouds, and then pump out campaigns that wink at social justice. And it's like, you give us just enough to talk about it, and then, we're either going to say, oh, this is really interesting, this is really positive, or like, oh, this is total shit, like, how dare they? We're going to, not buy from this place anymore, or, not pay for Netflix and all this other stuff. And it's like, that's not the point. It's like, they've already penetrated the attention economy to have us thinking about them and have us talking about them. And I know you laughed at the penetration.
Cody is a child today.
I'm always a child. I don't know what you mean.
But I'm saying, like, this is the entrapment that we fall into each time, is like, even these conversations that we're having lend credence to, the purchase of Netflix account to watch this, to give them our time and our brain cells. And I think, like, true crime in itself is a good example of this, because there's all these critiques and all these people saying like, oh, true crime is a problem. We've got a true crime obsession and it's really bad and everything else. And, we've seen this explosion of true crime in the past like 10 or 15 years, or I mean longer than that. We've got true crime books, we've got true crime movies, TV shows, podcasts, radio shows, if those still exist, everything else.
The Kansas classic In Cold Blood.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of what I was reading, was like, that was part of the start of it all, was In Cold Blood, which was supposed to be nonfiction journalism, but pretty fictional, just in all the parts that he embellished. But, Truman Capote was a real flamboyant dude. So one article I was reading called Why We Have to Stop the True Crime Obsession says, stories of true crime can, of course, be fascinating, exploring the shadowy corners of the human psyche, with the very best of the genre teaching us something about how we live and interact, as well as being important historical documents for change. Meanwhile, the production line of mainstream true crime content serves to simply glorify the titular killer and create a bizarre digital ode to their terrifying memory. And I think that paragraph kind of captures the ambivalence here, is like, there can be some use to it, but we're also just creating digital memorials of serial killers and their experience, which of course is problematic and stuff, but it sells. And like thinking of that second episode of Black Mirror, Lock Henry, also at one point coaching the guy on what to say when he's being interviewed on camera, like use words like eviscerated or horrifying or this and that. And, you know, there is a manufactured quality to this content that's being created.
Yeah.
And nothing I'm saying is surprising or new. So I don't really know why I'm saying it, but y'all were nodding, but I wasn't sure if that was like, oh, you're right, or like, oh, yeah, just stop talking.
No, it was you're right. It was you're right. And also, I'm tired.
On that note, thank you from all of us here at Unlivable Cultures. We hope you enjoyed the episode.